Russia. No matter your opinions and views about the country, its people, and especially its government, there's one aspect of Russia we can all agree on. It's goddamn gigantic. So massive, in fact, that pretty much all maps depicting it are factually wrong, which is bound to happen when you try to map out more than 3% of a 3D globe on a 2D surface. But how did Russia stretch so far into Siberia and become the territorial colossus it is today? Well, the answer is quite simple: by using the finest tools in their arsenal, the Cossacks. But who are the Cossacks? Where did they come from? What was their role in our world's history? How did they make Russia so big exactly? And most importantly of all, did they know who was in Paris? We'll discuss that and more in this video. The history of the Cossacks begins sometime around the 14th century in the vast Eurasian steppes, which were once conquered by the fierce Mongols and then ruled by the Golden Horde, their neglected bastardized child. Over time, however, the decline of the Horde left with it a huge power vacuum in the fields between the Dnieper and Volga rivers in modern-day Ukraine. The Poles, Lithuanians, Muscovites, aka Russians Light, and Tatars were all eager to expand into these fertile and abundant plains and claim them for themselves. However, consolidating permanent settlements there proved to be very difficult, with so many tribes, kingdoms, and khanates fighting one another to establish control over the region and their claims over the legacy of the Golden Horde. Coupled with constant attacks from raiders, mostly of Tatar origin, looking to enrich themselves by looting, pillaging, and kidnapping, the fields of modern-day Ukraine quickly turned into a lawless, desolate no-man's land known as the Wild East. Building your home, let alone a whole community in these harsh lands, was considered a death wish by any sane individual at the time. But where one man sees trash, another sees treasure. One by one, escaped convicts evading punishment, adventurers looking for thrill and treasures, raiders and freebooters preying on the unprepared, and peasants fleeing serfdom, mostly of Ruthenian origin, each established temporary camps which evolved into permanent fortified settlements and multicultural communities. Over time, these ragtag groups of outlaws and misfits began to thrive in these frontier lands few dare to venture in, and developed a way of life uniquely suited for these harsh conditions, drinking hard liquor, risking it all on blackjack, and beheading would-be invaders with pizzazz, aka the Cossack lifestyle. The very name Cossack hints at their free nature, originating from the Turkic word Kazakh, meaning freeman, nomad, or even raider and bandit. Cossacks embodied a spirit of independence, bravery, and resilience in the face of danger. Their society, born on the fringes of nations, was unique for its time, built on principles of equality and brotherhood. The foundation of Cossack society was the Voisko, or post, an independent military community. These weren't just scattered settlements, but organized structures functioning as military democracies. Imagine distinct Cossack nations of warriors, each governing itself. Across the vast Eurasian steppes, numerous hosts emerged, each centered on a specific region, like the Zaporozhian Cossacks along the Dnieper River, or the Yaik Cossacks by the Ural River. At the core of each host's self-governance was the Krug, the Cossack Assembly. This was not a symbolic gathering, but the very engine of Cossack decision-making. Visualize all adult Cossack men coming together in a circle, the Krug. But instead of jerking each other off, they debate and decide on critical matters, from declarations of war and treaties of peace to the allocation of land, the dispensing of justice, and the election of their leaders. It was within the dynamic and often tumultuous discussions of the Krug that the collective will of the Cossack host was formed and expressed. Military skill was paramount, given that Cossack culture was deeply intertwined with warfare. From boyhood, they trained relentlessly in horsemanship, swordsmanship, and firearms in order to prepare themselves physically and mentally for the harsh realities of life in no man's land. Constantly facing raids from neighboring groups and needing to effectively counter invaders, the Cossacks naturally developed exceptional horsemanship and sophisticated cavalry tactics. Renowned raiders and warriors, they turned these skills into the cornerstones of their military prowess, with their saber, or shashka, becoming an iconic weapon alongside increasingly adopted firearms. Beyond fighting, their culture was vibrant, devoutly Orthodox Christian, their faith blended with unique Cossack traditions. Soulful songs echoed across the steppe, telling tales of bravery and freedom, while energetic dances reflected their martial spirit. Distinctive clothing, white trousers, long robes called kaftans, and proud mustaches further defined their identity and image. Camaraderie and loyalty were most essential, as Cossacks saw themselves as brothers in arms, fiercely loyal to their host. Leadership was earned, not inherited. The hetman, or ataman, an elected leader chosen for wisdom and courage, was first among equals, accountable to the Krug, embodying Cossack self-determination. This blend of military democracy, martial culture, and brotherhood was the Cossack way of life. Beyond warriors, Cossacks were also masters of diverse crafts and professions: shepherds, sailors, superb horsemen and infantrymen, and farmers. In essence, the Cossacks were Eastern Europe's cowboys, Vikings, and pirates, all combined into one formidable and fascinating culture. However, if you were to ask a nobleman or boyar living in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Muscovy respectively, based on their experience with the Cossacks, they would tell you that their greatest profession was their role as border security. As these states expanded into the steppe frontier, they found it difficult to directly control these vast, sparsely populated lands. Cossacks already inhabiting these regions emerged as a natural, if sometimes unruly and cantankerous solution. Initially, Cossack communities often existed between these powers, shifting allegiances and sometimes serving both Poland and Muscovy depending on political winds and immediate needs. Loyalty was often fluid, and Cossacks were known to switch sides when it suited their interests or when offered better terms of service. Beyond Poland and Muscovy, other states bordering the steppe, like the Ottoman Empire, also began to recognize the Cossacks' value and sought to employ them. After all, no one would think of invading these far desolate no man's lands with thieves and raiders lurking beyond every corner. As such, the Poles and Muscovites and others saw the Cossacks as a necessary insurance policy, somewhat reliable bodyguards, and as useless idiots. Or at least, they were supposed to behave as such. Despite keeping the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Tsardom of Russia safe from other enemies like the Ottomans or Tatars, the Cossacks were still an unruly bunch, with no loyalty or allegiance towards anyone but themselves. It even seemed like anytime conflicts or uprisings arose in Eastern Europe, the Cossacks were always somehow involved, ready to revolt, raid, and plunder. Take for instance the relationship between the Zaporozhian Cossacks and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. While the Ukrainian steppe was a de facto no man's land, the lines drawn on the map placed the Zaporozhian Sich under the Commonwealth's control, and the Polish Szlachta tried relentlessly to make them a vital and reliable part of their society, to no avail. One day, the Cossacks would help them against the Russians and push all the way into Moscow. The next day, they would spark a war with the Ottomans due to their constant raids into Moldavia, which was under the Sultan's control. This dissatisfaction towards the Cossacks was reflected in the actions of the Polish nobility, who pushed for more attempts at Polonizing these uncultured yet useful brutes, limiting the influence of the Ruthenian Orthodox Church and crushing the Cossack rebellions of the early 17th century. Amongst these victims was a man named Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who, after suffering through harassment, land confiscation, arson, abuse of his son, and imprisonment at the hands of the Polish aristocracy, decided that enough is enough and rallied the Zaporozhian Cossacks to rebel against their Polish overseers in the event known as the Khmelnytsky Uprising or the Polish-Cossack War. Recalling the outcomes of past revolts and realizing that his army stood no chance against the mighty Polish hussars, Khmelnytsky called upon the service of an unlikely ally, the Crimean Khan. And so with the combined strength of the Crimean Tatar cavalry and the Cossack infantry, Khmelnytsky steamrolled the Polish army, joined by defecting Cossacks still enrolled in the Commonwealth's forces, as well as Orthodox Ruthenians rising up against Catholic persecution. After After pushing all the way to Kiev, Khmelnytsky, the hetman of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, declared his uprising as an Orthodox crusade against Catholic subjugation, and was immortalized as the restorer and sole bearer of the Kievan Rus' legacy, establishing the first independent proto-Ukrainian state, the Cossack Hetmanate. Moreover, for the Commonwealth, this catastrophic defeat pretty much ended the Polish Golden Age and doomed them to a decade of decline and deterioration, before their eventual partition by greater neighboring empires at the end of the 18th century. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because the establishment of the Cossack Hetmanate didn't mean the end of conflict, as the Poles managed to reconsolidate their forces and were eager to take back what was theirs. Bogdan Khmelnytsky needed to secure a formidable ally to help him fight back the Commonwealth, and after the Ottomans' refusal, the Crimean Tatars' betrayal in the Battle of Berestechko, the hetman had no choice but to request aid from the Tsar of Russia, Alexis, who also had a court to settle with the Commonwealth. In 1654, representatives of the two powers met and made an alliance that came to be known as the Pereiaslav Agreement, cementing the Cossacks' allegiance to the Tsar in exchange for military protection and autonomous status within the Russian state. The Pereiaslav Agreement was, and still remains, one of the most controversial moments in Cossack and Ukrainian history, especially since the original treaty is either lost or kept hidden, according to urban legends and conspiracies. On one hand, Bogdan Khmelnytsky's decision wasn't supported by everyone from the Hetmanate and the Zaporozhian host, leading to a great Cossack societal division between those who wished to stay true to the nomadic roots and those who welcomed the protection of Russia with open arms, chasing the riches and status promised by the Tsardom. On the other hand, the consequences of the agreement and the eventual breaking of its terms can be felt even today, through the narratives and motivations of both countries involved in the yet unresolved Ukrainian-Russian war. The Pereiaslav Agreement is the centerpiece used in most arguments regarding whether Ukraine should remain an independent nation or an autonomous part of Russia. Moreover, the concept of Russian-Ukrainian brotherhood still lingers in the minds of citizens of both countries, an idea spread during Soviet times based on the Pereiaslav Agreement, interpreted as the union of two long-lost brothers. But the most important effect of this agreement between the Russians and the Cossacks, which excluded the lingering territorial claims of the Poles, is that it started the Russo-Polish War, or the 13 Years' War, eventually contributing to the downfall of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Coincidentally, it was also a factor of the downfall of the Cossack freeman lifestyle, as the Hetmanate tried to regain some of its independent nomadic status to no avail. Many revolts, allegiance changes, societal divisions, and wars later, the Cossack Hetmanate lost their authority and were firmly placed under the control of the Russian Tsar. The Zaporozhian Cossacks were tasked as border guards, protecting the frontier around the Dnieper River against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Crimean Khanate, and the Ottoman Empire. However, other Cossack hosts had a far more active and offensive role in satisfying the Tsardom's imperialist aspirations. As I've alluded to in the introduction of this video, the Cossack warriors played a crucial role in Russia's expansion into Siberia. Recognizing their unique skills and frontier experience, the Russian Tsars strategically employed Cossacks as a key force in their eastward drive. This was achieved through a combination of incentives, offering land grants, resources, and opportunities for wealth in the newly conquered territories, as well as appealing to the Cossack tradition of military service and adventure. Kickstarted by Yermak Timofeyevich, Ataman of the Don Cossack host and Russian folk hero, the Cossacks expanded Russia's territory eastwards, deep into Siberian plains, also aided by Russian, Lithuanian, and German mercenaries. Throughout the 17th century, they conquered and claimed immense stretches of land in the name of the Tsar and defeated the native Tatar Khanates like Sibir, led by Kuchum Khan, as well as other indigenous tribes such as the Khanty Yankee and Mansi people, the Tuvans and Buryats, either directly by sheer military domination or indirectly by carrying deadly diseases like smallpox. The Cossacks crushed all opposition and expanded Russia's frontiers all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The Russians benefited tremendously from these expeditions, as not only did these vast territories give the Tsardom and eventual empire the needed legitimacy to stand as an equal amongst other European megapowers, but it also exponentially boosted one of Russia's biggest and most profitable trades: fur. Yes, even before the large and precious reserves of oil, gas, and rare minerals were unearthed in these lands, Siberia was seen as Russia's cash cow, thanks to its abundance of fur and wildlife, because of fuck them animals. Meanwhile, the Cossacks were promised territorial autonomy and self-determination, as well as land, power, and fortunes in exchange for their servitude and loyalty to the Tsar. Tempted by these promises of power and glory, many Cossacks abandoned their traditional nomadic way of life and joined the Russian army. All in all, the exploitation of Siberia was tremendously beneficial to both factions. The 18th century proved to be a massive turning point in Cossack history, as the expanding Russian Empire under ambitious rulers like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great sought to align itself with the rest of Europe by modernizing and centralizing the Russian state. The royal administration, while grateful for the Cossacks' military service, wasn't too fond of their independent spirit and lawless frontiers, nor did the Cossacks take too kindly to their demands of returning fugitive serfs, nor confining themselves to traditional boundaries. By beginning of the century, Russian troops rounded up runaway serfs who had sought Cossack protection, dragging them back to lives of servitude. Cossack expansion into the Upper Don and Azov regions was banned, but the Cossacks resisted their old habits of independence, clashing directly with the Imperial will. In 1706, a military expedition was launched to enforce Russian authority. This sparked the Bulovin Rebellion, a major Don Cossack uprising supported by Zaporozhians. Though initially successful, Bulovin's rebellion was ultimately crushed by Peter's superior forces. Bulovin himself perished, and the Don Cossacks were for the moment subdued, their expansionist ambitions checked. Some, unwilling to accept Russian rule, fled east to the Kuban River, seeking protection from the Ottoman Empire and forming the Kuban Cossack host. This host, alongside others like the Zaporozhian and Yaik, more Ural Cossacks, were repressed and punished. In clear displays of imperial dominance and authority, a symbolic shift occurred in 1721. Cossack affairs were transferred from the Foreign Ministry to the War Ministry in Moscow, a virtual annexation into the Russian state. Under this sustained pressure from Peter and his successors, the traditional Cossack way of life began to erode, and the once nomadic freemen became Russia's imperialist enforcers. The freebooting democratic spirit waned as many turned to farming and enrolled in the Russian army. Yet, for those without land or means, the old Cossack traditions of banditry persisted, now targeting not just outsiders but fellow Cossacks as well. Loyal Cossacks were increasingly forced to police their own rebellious brothers, fighting alongside Russian troops to maintain order. Discontent simmered throughout the 18th century, fueled by grievances like inequality, serfdom, and forced conscription of free Cossacks into the regular army. The resentment ignited in the massive Pugachev rebellion, an uprising that shook the foundations of Catherine the Great's Russia. It began amongst the Yaik Cossacks, and its head was Emelian Pugachev, a Don Cossack and former lieutenant in the Russian army, who boldly declared himself to be the assassinated Tsar Peter III, Catherine's deceased husband. Don't laugh. It was a common and quite successful tactic during the time of troubles. This claim resonated deeply with many Cossacks, peasants, and other disaffected groups who longed for a just and rightful ruler. Pugachev's rebellion rapidly gained momentum, spreading like wildfire across the Volga and Ural regions. Cossacks, joined by peasants, ethnic minorities, and even some disgruntled nobles, flocked to his banner. His forces, though often poorly equipped compared to the regular Russian army, achieved remarkable early successes. Pugachev's rebels laid siege to the fortress of Orenburg and inflicted defeats on government forces sent to suppress them. For a time, the rebellion posed a serious threat to Catherine's rule, engulfing a vast territory in chaos and violence. The uprising was marked by intense brutality on both sides, reflecting deep social and political tensions within the Russian Empire. Ultimately, despite initial victories and widespread support, the Pugachev rebellion was brutally suppressed by the Russian Imperial army. After suffering key defeats in open battle, Pugachev's forces were gradually worn down. He was eventually betrayed by his own Cossack followers, captured and publicly executed in Moscow in 1775. The rebellion, though ultimately unsuccessful, left a lasting impact. It demonstrated a deep-seated discontent within Cossack communities and the wider Russian populace. It had forced Catherine the Great to further consolidate imperial control over the Cossacks and the frontier regions. In the aftermath of the Pugachev rebellion, the Yaik River and host were renamed the Ural and Ural Cossack host, respectively, heavily garrisoned by Russian troops, a clear sign of imperial control. The Volga Cossacks were forcibly relocated to the Caucasus, further tightening the empire's grip. Having concluded a successful war against the Ottoman Turks in 1774, Catherine the Great moved to eliminate the final bastion of Cossack independence, the Zaporozhian Sich. In 1775, a veteran Russian army led by Grigory Potemkin and including Don Cossacks in its ranks descended upon the lower Dnieper, crushing the Zaporozhian host. Their leadership was exiled or executed, while some Zaporozhians were later revived as the Black Sea host to serve Russia against the Turks in Crimea. They never regained their former autonomy. By the beginning of the 19th century, the Cossacks had been successfully pacified into the Imperial military's most formidable asset. Deployed in many battles for reconnaissance missions, horse artillery, infantry bolstering, and cavalry skirmishes and raids. Aside from being early colonizers and imperial enforcers of Siberia, the Cossack forces played a key role in the Russian Empire's expansion into Central Asia. They fought tirelessly against the Ottomans in their endless battles for supremacy on the Black Sea. They were a crucial part of the Tsar's defense against Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion into Russian territory, and their vicious raids and attacks, combined with Russia's scorched earth tactics, devastated the French army. Napoleon himself was awestruck by the unconventional tactics and either respectably or frustratingly claimed that Cossacks are the finest light troops among all nations. If I had them in my army, I would go through all the world with them. The Cossacks continued to play their role in aiding the Russian army, scoring decisive victories and crushing rebellions and uprisings across the empire, up until the 20th century. Whilst they tried to play their usual part during World War I, morale was extremely low across the entire army, and the subsequent Russian Revolution and Civil War deeply fractured Cossack communities. During the revolution, Cossacks found themselves on both sides of the conflict, with some supporting the Bolsheviks and others aligned with the White Movement, often based on regional loyalties and socio-economic divisions. This internal conflict led to immense losses and further weakened the traditional Cossack way of life. Eventually, the Bolsheviks managed to seize total control over the former Russian Empire, and the newly established Soviet Union underwent a total cultural and societal overhaul. The Soviets focused extensively on cleansing of all imperial and royal remnants of a bygone era, and due to their loyalty to the Russian crown and White Army, this anti-imperial cleansing also affected the Cossack forces and communities. Not limited to only the former supporters of the White Army, the Cossacks were repressed, disposed of their lands, deported, and marked either as Russians or Ukrainians, in a campaign to completely eliminate Cossack identity and social structures. Decades later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a resurgence of Cossack culture and identity in Russia and Ukraine. The Don Cossacks in particular have continued to this day to call for national autonomy and self-rule, hoping to re-establish the Don Cossack Republic. Cossack organizations and cultural groups re-emerged, focusing on preserving traditions, historical memory, and in some cases playing a role in military or civic life in the post-Soviet era. Recently, they have succeeded in regaining their positions of frontier guards and police units, representing an active part in Russia's recent military campaigns in Ukraine, in a joint desire to fulfill their territorial claims. And yeah, that was the history of the Cossacks, a fascinating civilization famous for their independent, nomadic, and free-spirited lifestyle, and eventually turned by a large empire into their instrument of conquest, colonization, and oppression. This duality, the legacy of freedom and self-reliance intertwined with service to empire, remains a central and often debated aspect of the Cossack historical narrative, leaving a complex and enduring mark on Eastern European history. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like and smash that subscribe button, and if you really did, become a member like these wonderful people. My name is Janusz, and you've watched Living Ironically in Europe.